Okay, so welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. I want to thank everyone for coming. I know it's often very busy in your schedule to make time for things like webinars, and we promise today that you'll get a lot of good information on what's going on with the product and with Ignite UI, and we'll get you excited with some of the new features that we're shipping in 13.1, and as well as some demos of some of the new features. So again, my name is Jason Beres. I'm the Senior VP of Developer Tools at Infragistics. If you ever have any questions after this webinar or ever want to email me about product issues, suggestions, ideas, etc., my email is jasonb@infragistics.com, or you can get me on Twitter at jasonberes. So what we're going to talk about today in our agenda is what is Ignite UI. So for folks that have never used Ignite UI, what exactly is Ignite? What's new in 13.1? We'll do some demos, and then we'll wrap it up with some of the resources at the end that you guys can use for getting help and future stuff about the product. So really, what is Ignite? What we decided to do when we built Ignite was build a standards-based, touch-enabled HTML5 and jQuery toolset. The point of HTML5 and jQuery is that today you need to build for multiple devices that span different types of processors, but they all have browsers. So I want to write applications that can run inside of a browser across multiple devices, and I want it to be touch-enabled. So you have to build something for a desktop device, as well as maybe a mobile phone or a tablet, or even use frameworks like PhoneGap or Nomad from Adobe. So some of the highlights of Ignite UI are really around the fact that it is based on jQuery. It's a pure HTML5 jQuery-based tool set. It's a client-side tool set, so you're not looking at needing a server piece to actually use Ignite UI. We do ship MVC wrappers, so you can do server-side application development with Ignite with MVC 2, 3, or now MVC 4. So that's up to you. You can use C#, Full IntelliSense, Visual Studio, etc., or you can use Notepad++ or WebStorm or whatever IDE that you choose on your processor of choice to build out applications. We have ThemeRoller support plus CSS3 support, so if you're doing ThemeRoller themes, they'll come across in Ignite very nicely. We also ship with a default Infragistics theme, and actually right now we're working on a new Ignite theme, which I'll be excited to probably talk more about mid-summer timeframe. And I did mention around mobile devices, which means everything has to be touch. Everything nowadays is touch. The computer I'm working on right now doing this webinar is a touch computer. So you have to be able to ensure that when you roll out applications, be them browser-based or native, that you do have a great touch-first experience. Now, as far as grids go, we're really completed the trifecta of awesomeness in 13.1 with shipping our OLAP pivot grid. So we've always had the flat grid, high performance, flat tabular grid, hierarchical data grid, and now we've added an OLAP pivot grid, which means you can connect to SQL Server analysis services, any type of OLAP data on your server side that you have through XMLA. We also have a blog we're working on now about connecting through ADOMD on the server side to target your client jQuery application, but also you can bind to flat data and just allow your users to pivot that data. So for example, you can load up an Excel spreadsheet inside of this grid and then pivot that data in the client side in the browser without having that server piece needed. We also have a lot of really great charting controls. I'll get into that in a little bit. So data visualization is very important for what we offer in the product, as well as geospatial mapping. We have a really rich geospatial map control, which allows you to do high-performance geospatial rendering of data, any type of plotting, weather plotting, scatter plotting. And the nice thing about our geospatial controls is they share the same core as our chart, so you get the same level of performance across the board. And then last but not least, as a highlight, we'll say, is we do have specific mobile controls. So if I think about building an app for a tablet or a desktop, I may want to use sort of bigger desktop-like controls like a pivot grid per se. But if I'm targeting a mobile phone, I may want to just use a list control, a mobile list control, or a mobile rating control, or some other very specific jQuery mobile control. We have you covered there as well. And along with that, on all of the mobile controls, we have adaptive CSS. So if you're viewing your mobile app on top of a Windows phone, the correct CSS to make it look good will be there. And if you're rendering on an iPhone, it'll make the controls will look like an iPhone as well. So the adaptive CSS is a really nice feature in the jQuery mobile controls that we offer. Now I want to touch on just a few other points about Ignite. So performance is something we build in from the core. It's not something that we think about later. This goes across all of our products, so not just Ignite UI, but in our XAML products and our other web products and our Windows Forms products. So we know that performance really means everything when you're running inside of a browser, but it also means everything when you're just trying to load data, scroll data, zoom in and zoom out of data, view real-time data. We pay a lot of attention to that. We have information on our website you can go check out, some performance white papers on the type of numbers that you should be able to see. But we're talking about millions of data points in milliseconds and in seconds to render in real time across the charts and the grid. So if you happen to have some unique situation around performance, we'd love to hear about it. We'd love to help you, and we'd love to make sure that it gets into the product and that we hit those needs. On the data visualization side, I did mention earlier I want to talk about this a little bit more just from a high level. We do build in all of the touch and interactions that you would expect. We've done tons of performance analysis on the charts and the maps to see that we have really top performance in the market. But if we look at what we offer, we have 49 built-in series for the Ignite UI chart. So that means that pretty much every single business chart scenario that you have, we have you covered. We have 10 built-in markers, 13 trend lines, 34 financial indicators, 2 financial overlays. We support composite charting, having multiple series on a chart. You can customize markers in HTML. You can synchronize multiple charts on a page. So if you're looking at anything from a stock analysis display to a medical display with multiple charts showing all types of real-time data, you can do that with the Ignite UI charting controls. Now on the data visual or on the line of business side, I mentioned the OLAP grid earlier, but we've also expanded the feature set and new controls in this release across the Ignite product. So the OLAP pivot grid obviously is a huge feature, but we've also added layout features and responsive web design features. So we have a new control, sort of a tile manager-like control, which we've shipped in other platforms. Now we're bringing that to Ignite UI. And we've also shipped a flow layout engine, so essentially just a layout engine in general, which will let you create ad hoc row and column span scenarios on a page, and then have the widgets inside of those areas resize as the grid or as your browser resizes. So, for example, you may look at websites now where there's a bunch of images or text, and it's nicely laid out in a sort of a grid format, and as the web browser resizes, so do the containers of the content. Well, you can do that now with our layout manager in Ignite UI. If you want to have an interactive experience where end users can expand and collapse areas of the screen, you can do that with our tile layout control. So it adds sort of an interactive UI adorner on top of the layout control. And then just general responsive web design. So we've added this to the grid and some of the other controls where through CSS you can say, well, if I'm showing this on a tablet, hide these columns or use this sort of custom template if the size of the browser gets to be this small. So we've done some pretty interesting things there. And you can see the rest of the list just in general what we offer in the product. So HTML editors, tree views, autocomplete combo boxes, all sorts of data entry controls. We have a really rich data source control, which we've done webinars on the past, which we'll probably do another webinar soon since we've added some features in that product or in that control. But also our PDF, XPS, Excel, Word libraries. Those are server side, so you can do stuff but still render it down inside the client. And then we've also enhanced for this release, we'll talk about our file upload control, but we also have rating control, video player control. So all told, we have a couple dozen really rich UI controls for any type of experience you want to build on the web. On the mobile side, we ship about 15 or 20 mobile-specific controls. I would say that the key control in this scenario is the mobile list control. The mobile list control gives you a lot neat capability as far as displaying lists, interacting with lists, having a hierarchical display of data where you select an item and the list goes to a new view of sub data inside the list. And again, we've done a lot of work around the adaptive CSS, so you don't have to think about, is this running on an iPhone, is this running on an Android? We're going to make it look good automatically for you built into the product. So with that, let's talk about what's new in 13.1. And what I want to sort of prefix as we talk about the Ignite UI product in general is the overall philosophy with this product is that we want to work well with third-party frameworks in the market. So we're not trying to be the ultimate framework that you only use Ignite to build your app, because we know that's not going to happen. So as frameworks become, for lack of a better word, popular, things like Knockout.js, History.js, JS Render, Backbone, etc., we'll make sure that our product integrates well with it. If there's issues, we want to address it. But we look at this as an enormous community in the web, and there's new frameworks popping up every day. So we're not going to probably ship what you might say we've done in the Windows Forms product, where the Windows Forms product has everything built into it. And the reason is the Windows Forms space isn't open like the web space. So as we see more and more stuff out there, we're going to try to work with it better and better inside the product. So as you guys see more frameworks come out, please let us know if there's something popular that you think we should QA against and make sure our testers are looking at. Please let me know. So let's get on to some of the highlights. I talked about the responsive design control integration. I'll do some demos of that a little bit later. We've done some new controls around layout, mobile, OLED pivot charts, and then we've enhanced our Knockout.js support. So you can do Knockout across not only the grid now, but the chart, the tree, and all the editors. So pretty much anything that's data bound, you'll be able to use Knockout for, which is pretty cool. So on the grid enhancement, some of the three biggest ones are around column moving, cell merging, and responsive web design. So column moving is interesting because historically when you do a column moving scenario, what you're doing is with your mouse, you're selecting a column header and then you're dragging it with your mouse. Well, what ends up happening is on a touch device, if you do a tap and hold, based on the device, different things happen. So we've actually created a new UI, which you see in the lower right-hand screenshot here, where if you want to move a column, you just select the adorner on the column and up will pop a simple dialog which lets you do everything with touch. So if you're on a mobile phone or if you're on a tablet and you don't have a mouse, you can't do the drag and hold. We do this in all of the controls where there's some sort of a tap and hold integration. So when you think about filtering, we'll do the same thing in filtering, or grouping. There's custom dialogues and grouping that pop up. So you give your users a really good experience no matter what device they're actually working on. The second item, probably one of the top 10 requested features in the grid, is around cell merging. You can see this in the bigger picture on the right where a sort has occurred and the like cells are merged together, and then you have the option of how you want that displayed. So in this case, we have sort of a light gray highlight of the like cell, so you can see very easily that there's multiple sales representatives and one vice president of sales. So cell merging is kind of an easier way to do a grouping. You don't have to make the user do too much interaction with the grid. They can just do a sort, and the cell merge will occur, and you can do this on multiple columns at once. And then you can see the responsive web design screenshot there where we have phone and tablet. I'm going to walk you through a demo of that in a little bit, so I won't spend too much time talking about the screenshot. And as well here, I've got some nice code. In fact, Tom Puglisi, who's one of our technical evangelists, just joined me, and this is some of the samples that he's written around responsive UI for the grid. And it's very easy. You can do this through CSS media queries or right through features on the columns of a grid configuration. So for example, in this case, for product ID, on the desktop view, based on the size of the browser, it should be hidden. Hidden equals false. So I actually want to show it on a desktop, but on a mobile phone, there's no need to show this column. I have very limited space. So I'm going to make sure that I use my space effectively. We also give you the ability to template each column based on the size of the browser width as well. So, for example, on a bigger screen where you're showing all columns, you may have company name in a column. You may have the person's image in a column, their address in a column, but on a phone you want it to be a single column with all of that in a single cell. So you can template it very nicely and do some pretty neat things with how that display works. So on the OLAP side, we've done some pretty cool stuff with OLAP, and the idea here is in the XAML side, we've shipped a pivot grid control with OLAP capability, and that ended up being one of the controls that gets the most feature requests and has the most activity because it is so versatile. So we took this now to HTML jQuery, so now you have a pure client-side experience for working with OLAP data within the browser. So the first thing that we needed to do here was create or augment the data source story that we have across Ignite UI. So as you know, in Ignite we have the IG data source control. Inside the IG data source control, there's all kinds of capabilities to automatically get data from a REST service, from OData, parse JSON data, load XML data, have schemas. It's a very rich functionality in our data source, and we take a lot of the work out of what you would normally have to write as far as parsing code and downloading code. We do all that for you. So now we've done the same thing for the OLAP data source. So when you're building an application with OLAP data, you have the option of using an XML data source, which will go directly to a URL on the server. You can pump data in from a server side through ADOMD. You can use a flat data source, as I mentioned earlier. But essentially the story here is we're giving you several UIs, all JavaScript, all HTML on the client, and we're giving you a couple ways to get data from the server, but we're not limiting you from however you want to get data from the server. So if you have a specific way of getting data from the server and you get it on the client in some format, you can still work with our controls on the client side. So let's go through how we've sort of separated out this control. Instead of creating this big single-purpose control that had all of the features in one, we decided to split up the OLAP experience into multiple controls. So the first thing we did was created a data selector control. And what we have here is a nice screenshot of the data selector on the right, and then how the items match up to maybe terms you're familiar with working with OLAP data. So obviously we've got a data selector, a cube selector. You can select your measure groups. And then we have a hierarchical data navigator, which has all of your measures, hierarchies, levels. And then down on the bottom, and you're probably thinking to yourself, well, this looks exactly like what I'm used to seeing in Microsoft Excel or something like that. Well, that's the idea. We sort of mimic that view, and this is a similar view that we brought over from our XAML controls as well, where you have your filters, columns, rows, measures. Obviously, based on the data, you may want to have a defer update, so you don't want the update to happen automatically. You control when we go back to get data from the server, and then there's a refresh button. But keep in mind, this is a separate control. So, for example, we have examples on the website where we're binding OLAP data to an HTML table. You don't even have to use our grid. Well, how are we getting that OLAP data? Well, we're using the IG XML data source, and we're using maybe the data selector to manipulate what's going back and forth to the server and then rendering it in pure HTML on the client. Not even using the Infragistics pivot grid control per se. So by keeping these separate, you can create your own OLAP experiences. This also comes in really handy for data visualization. Let's say you have a sales cube with a bunch of demographic data on where people are purchasing, and you want to bind that to our geospatial map. No problem. Get the data, use the selector to allow the user to figure out what data they want to display in what regions, and as they select individual data pieces, you could reflect that in the geospatial map. So you get a lot of flexibility because we've split this up into separate controls. So now the control that probably you will use the most realistically and your end users are going to touch the most is the pivot grid itself. The pivot grid is the full interactive grid experience that you can bind OLAP data to or flat data, as we mentioned earlier. It allows users to expand and collapse dimensions. It allows sorting and filtering and pivoting of the data. We have drop-down hierarchical views of the data that is being bound to the pivot grid through the data selector, the data navigator. So if you want to use the controls in conjunction, you can as separate widgets, or you can use them separately for your experience. But 9 times out of 10, a user is going to interact with that pivot grid. And then we have finally the pivot view control, and the pivot view control combines the pivot grid, the data selector, and our splitter control, which again is a new control that we're shipping in 13.1. So in this case, you just may say, listen, I want to have a full screen pivot experience. I'm going to drag the pivot view out onto the form in JavaScript, set up some of my connection information, and then just like that, you have the whole Excel experience that you're used to. But although it's in HTML, it's in jQuery, it's all running inside of the browser of your choice. So this is pretty exciting. We think this will be, again, equally as popular as it has been across our other platforms. And because it is so versatile, you can bind this to flat data to give your users a little bit more interesting and interactive experience with pivoting data in the client, that you may use this for something new that in the past you might have used a hierarchical grid or a flat grid for. So we're pretty excited about the pivot grid control and what it can bring to the types of apps that you're building. So that's not all, though. We've done more. So let's look at some of the other controls and other stuff that we've added. Now, I've talked about the Layout Manager earlier. I think this is probably one of the more interesting controls because it brings out the real newness that people expect in a web experience versus what you've previously built maybe in a rich client experience or even what you can do by yourself in a web page just trying to put tables together. You probably look to frameworks like Twitter Bootstrap that may have had layout capability for you. Well, now you don't have to do that. You can just use our Layout Manager, or you could use our controls in something like Twitter Bootstrap because we work well with Twitter Bootstrap and we share the same media query CSS syntax. So when you're using the grid, it'll play nicely within your experience using those third-party frameworks as well. But the Layout Manager allows you to have a flow layout, a border layout, a vertical layout, column layouts based on different resizing algorithms. So you are setting up column spans and row spans based on how you want your page laid out. And then what we do is we handle the resizing of these layouts when the browser gets resized. And if the browser never gets resized, it's just a fixed layout view. So this is nice because historically in the web, when you start putting together, when you're coming from a rich client, you want to have sort of a fixed view of the world. You want to have things maybe on the right-hand side or things fixed to the bottom. You may want to have different areas of the layout be scrollable. You can do this with the Layout Manager. So finally you have a way very easily out of the box to say, I want to create this type of layout and I want users to be able to resize certain elements of this layout and other areas of the layout do not get resized. It's all based on how you've set this up. Now, I mentioned earlier that we had the Tile Manager-like experience on top of this. That's a separate control. So the Layout Manager is actually used by our Tile Manager, and we'll use our Layout Manager across other controls in the future when layout needs to come into play. So this is the Tile Manager, which is actually pretty exciting. So the Tile Manager gives you this view of expandable and collapsible regions of a page. So the end user can actually resize areas of the page and interact with those, allow the user to interact with those. And if you have some sort of a persistence framework that you want to use, the next time the user comes in, the layout can be automated through that mechanism. But really, this goes to, again, a richer web layout, being able to give the end user more control over how their screen is arranged and how much information you can put on a screen. I look at this as very useful in dashboard scenarios where you may open up a dashboard and have several grids and several charts, but you want to focus the user on maybe one of those grids or one of those charts, but the user still needs to see the full breadth of information in the other aspects of the data. Well, then they can just simply click on the adorners and expand those areas of the screen themselves. They're not limited to actually what you're trying to project in your dashboard. The splitter control I mentioned, we're using this in the pivot view. So this is a brand new control, highly requested control. It gives you another great layout experience. So you can have any number of panels on a screen that can be resized, collapsed, expanded. The users can interact with this. And the example we have here is sort of a master detail, whereas I select something in one panel, it's updating items in other panels. This is all happening down in the client in JavaScript. But let's say the user doesn't want to see the grid on the bottom. They can simply just collapse that area of the screen and move on and continue working with the screen. Now, getting into some of the data visualization controls, the gauge is probably one of our most requested controls since we released our data visualization suite in Ignite UI. So if you want to create a dashboard, you need a gauge. So the gauge, of course, is very highly customizable and configurable. You can do all sorts of layouts with it, all sorts of styling with it. But at the end of the day, when you see most sales dashboards, even though there's all kinds of recommendations around what type of data visualization you should use in certain areas, the gauge still ends up being sort of a showcase of dashboards, and people love gauges. And Tom's nodding at me because I know he does a lot of gauges in his reports as well, along with charts and trend lines, etc. Doughnut chart, maybe not something that you use every day, but the Doughnut chart gives you the ability to group items visually within a multiple ring sort of data binding scenario. So you can have multiple levels of data, multiple slices of data per se, different categories of data grouped together, and all of this can be customized and is highly visual control. The roadmap for this is pretty interesting. So in 13.1, we added the ability to render multiple rings, inner radius, different selection scenarios, others categories, etc. Of course, all the styling. But now we're working on features like being able to click on a slice and having that slice explode out into further data. So the Doughnut chart is just this is the V1 of the Doughnut chart. We're going to continue to enhance this over time. But this again was for the financial verticals ends up being something that gets requested a lot. And so we went ahead and added this into the Ignite toolkit for 13.1, and we're pretty excited about shipping the Doughnut chart to all the customers that have been asking for it. Likewise, the funnel chart. This is really useful in sales scenarios. So you get a lot of, when you're looking at your CRM applications or Salesforce.com, inevitably you're going to see funnel charts. So where are we at in the funnel to achieve XYZ goals? And this is why this control is so oft requested. We actually had some requests from Microsoft on doing this in Windows 8. That's why you see this in our Windows 8 Windows UI toolkit around CRM. And so now it's in Ignite UI. And again, if any type of sales data, any type of need for weighting categories against each other or slices per se in a funnel, and then the different views. So we also have the Bezier curve as well. And the Bezier curve will actually be true to the weighting of each slice. It's not going to it's not a visual trick. And then when we think about dashboards and sort of quick hit data on inside of a grid, for example, you want to have an overview of a 12-month trend or a 12-month sale. You want to view win-loss reports in a CRM application for customer scenarios. This is where Spark charts come into play. So I'm really excited about this because this really, with all the data visualization controls we have, with the gauges, with now the funnel chart, now we've added the Sparklines. We've sort of completed all of the key scenario visualizations that you would need to build out almost any type of dashboard. So we have the ability to do Spark lines, Spark area, Spark columns, win-loss, and with these you get the almost same features that you get in their big charts, which are in the IG data chart control, where you have markers and trend lines and high-low ranges, interpolations, axes, and tooltips. So it's not just the rendering of the line. You get other features with this as well. So if you want to see a trend line on your Spark column chart, you can do that. You can do that. You can embed this inside of a grid column. You can embed this inside of one of the panels that you created in the layout manager, and it'll resize accordingly. So the Spark chart is pretty exciting, and it really does continue the whole data visualization dashboarding story that we filled out in 13.1 with Ignite UI. Now, file upload, one of the biggest features that was asked was multiple file upload support. So in the previous file upload, it was only one file at a time. Now we've done multiple file uploads, and on the MVC wrapper side, we've enhanced it even further to let you save the file to memory streams or file streams. So this is really a full-featured, complete file upload control now. There's some nice samples which show things like progression on the file uploads, etc. So we're excited that we got a chance to actually spend the time on this and deliver sort of a more complete file upload control in 13.1. The other big thing that we shipped in 12.2 was around our control configurator, and I have to admit I knew that there would be a certain set of folks that found this very useful, but really we've gotten a ton of feedback on the control configurator, and it's helped a lot of people get started with the toolkit, especially folks who aren't familiar as much with JavaScript. They're coming from a rich client like Windows Forms or WPF, and they have to do something in HTML JavaScript with our product. The control configurator really helps out. So we've updated the control configurator with all of the 13.1 controls. So for example, you're going to see in there now the tile manager. So you can select the tile manager, and you have the nice property editor on the right-hand side where it'll let you set all the properties on it, and then we will generate the JavaScript for you that you can literally just paste into your application and have an up and running sample just like that. So we're pretty excited that we're going to continue to invest in the control configurator. I think it's one of a set of tools that you'll see us ship this year that help your productivity. A big focus for me and our team is really around making you more productive with the tool set so you can get your job done faster. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and escape out of this and open up a couple samples. So let me open up Notepad++ here, and I've got a bunch of different HTML samples that we'll go through. I won't go through any of the MVC samples. I think this is probably one of the easiest ways to get an idea of what's going on with the product is just by looking at some of the JavaScript that you would normally see. So I've just sort of made my text a little bit bigger. Hopefully you'll all be able to see it. But if you're not familiar with Ignite UI and how easy it is to get something going with the product, this is a good place to start. So this is the responsive web design mode for the grid. So this example, we're going to go through how you can just set up the responsive web design in the grid just through setting configuration on the grid itself. So let me scroll down a bit and show you what we're actually going to bind to. In this case, we have Northwind customer data. So I'm just going to go, we have a JavaScript file here that just has Northwind data. We're going to go get that Northwind data and use it in our, to display our data, and we're going to bind it to an HTML table called grid. So when we're looking at the IG grid and it's going to bind to the grid element using a jQuery selector, that's what we're doing here. So everything I do now is going to instantiate this grid, and it's going to bind it to my grid element on the page. So there's a couple ways to actually set up a grid inside of Ignite UI. The first way, very simply, is just to instantiate a grid like I have, and then set no properties on it, no configuration, and you just bind it to an element, and then you can load data into it. In that case, you're not configuring anything. We're going to auto-generate the columns ourselves, and the grid will really have no features. In this case, what we're doing is we are setting up the columns ourselves, and we're just going to tell auto-generate columns, set that to false. So I don't actually want this to auto-generate columns. The reason when you look at the grid you may want to auto-generate columns is maybe you don't know all of the data, you're just trying to do something quick and dirty, but by auto-generating the columns you can ensure that the data types are correct for things like filtering, sorting, grouping, as well as we don't have to figure that out ourselves at runtime. So by setting up the columns and the data types per column, you're going to save a little bit of time at runtime. Very easily, I mentioned earlier we had Northwind as our data source. We're going to bind this to data source, and pretty much that's it. So if I wasn't doing anything to this grid, all I would need to do is have this amount of text, and I would bind it to the grid, or JavaScript bind it to the grid, and I would be done. What we're going to do is we're going to add a few features to the grid. So the way the Ignite UI grid works is you just add features to a collection that the grid consumes at runtime, and it'll render however you're telling it to render. So do you want column sorting, cell merging? For cell merging, what properties do you want? What attributes do you want around cell merging or column filtering? What kind of layout do you want? What kind of template do you want? So all of that is done through setting up features. So in this case, I have my responsive features, and on my columns, I'm going to go ahead and set up how I want my columns to display in my responsive features. So in this case, and this is pretty much similar to the screenshot we saw. So for the ID on the phone, I want this column hidden. The custom alternate for this is hidden equals false. So any other layout, show this column. On a phone, don't show the column. And you can see that we're setting the same thing up here for each one of these items. So based on the template that you want to use or the layout, you can say show it in this size, don't show it in this size, so you have multiple sizes of your browser to visualize what columns you actually want to display in the grid. Now the other nice thing, as I mentioned in the slides, that you can have a template. So based on the configuration that you have set up, you may want to combine different columns into a single column based on the size. So here, for the phone template, for the phone size, I want to use this custom template. So I want to combine address, city, and country when I render this in my phone view. And that's pretty much it. You can see here I've set up a custom responsive value. So I've got custom phone, min width is 0, max width is 500, and then I set up my own custom alternate. So I'm saying my minimum width for this is going to be 501 pixels. My max width is going to be whatever the max value is on the screen, so it's going to fill up the screen width. Now, you can do this through features, like I said, or you can do it straight through media queries and CSS. As well, if you're using Twitter Bootstrap, we'll respect the media queries that Twitter Bootstrap uses to display based on the size of the screen. So let me go ahead and run this guy in the browser. You can see that I have a nice view. I've got customer ID, company name, contact. All of my fields are visible. Now as I resize, everything is visible, and then when I get down to that phone view, I only have 2 columns visible, and you can see that my address column is combining the street, the city, and the country. So you have the custom template that we've defined, and I'm looking at this on the screen, and you can see as I move, it just changes automatically. So if this was just straight up rendered in a phone emulator, it would render like this. If it was straight up rendered on your iPad, the iPad would actually render it like this. So it's all based on the width of the screen, how this is set up. So that's the responsive web design. There is a really good blog post on the layout and the responsive web design that we posted a few days ago. If you go to blogs@infragistics.com, you can check it out because you're going to see some more details about it. Now, column fixing, I mentioned this earlier. This is one of the more interesting features of the grid because you can do this in Excel. So anything people want in Excel, they want in the grids as well. It's very easy to do this. All you're doing is setting an isFixed property at runtime or at design time on the control, or you're just saying that you want to enable column fixing in general on the grid. So here I have the column fixing attribute set for features, so now I'm going to enable column fixing for the grid, but I want company name to be fixed by default. So if I go ahead and I run this again in Chrome, what I end up with is a grid, and you'll notice that company name is fixed to the left. As I scroll, it doesn't move. Now let's go ahead and fix contact title. I'll click the pin adorner on the column header, and you can see now that I have 2 columns fixed. So you got a really nice layout there, and I will, I always like to show things in multiple browsers just because people tend to worry when everyone shows everything in Chrome, they question if it actually works in IE. Of course, everything works in IE. And you can see, you can scroll right to left, and you get the nice fixed column. So the column fixing is really cool. It's a really useful layout capability, and it does give the end users the ability to do better data analysis on something like this. All right, so then let's look at cell merging. Again, this is one of my more favorite features as far as giving the user the ability to group data without having to go through the trouble of a grouping experience. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this guy. We'll put it in Chrome. And here's my grid. And you can see that by default, I told it to merge like cells on the grid. So you'll see that title is merged, address is not sorted, city is sorted, or actually they're all merged by default. Region is going to be merged by default in country. So any column that I actually click on, I will show those merged values. So in this case, sales rep, sales manager. Let's just sort region. So now region automatically is going to pick up my cell merge. And you can see that it did the same for country. As I hover over each record, the merged value is displayed in its regular color and font. And if I'm not hovering over anything, it's visually clear to me that there are like records because we just dim out sort of with the disabled colored font, a very light gray font on the country. But it's very high performance. It works really well. And what it does is it sort of gives you another option to do something beyond the grouping scenarios that, you know, a lot of times are what we use. Now let's look at the Bezier curves. Actually, we'll do the grid layout really quick. I just want to show very easily the layout manager syntax and sort of how you can set up a really custom view. So in this case, I have I'm using the layout control, the layout manager. I'm going to bind it to an HTML element on my page called layout. All of this stuff that I'm actually doing here is just setting up different colors so it's very easy to see what each layout item looks like. But I'm setting up column spans and row spans on the data. So you can actually see that I want a column span of 2 on one item, and within that column span, I'm going to have different HTML text within each span. So you can set this up however you like. What we're doing here is I'm doing a lot of sort of JavaScript code to set it up declaratively, and I'm also setting up a lot of code to set the colors on it, so visually it looks okay. And now down in the grid layout, I have the items, which is saying I want a row span of 2, a column span of 2, and it's going to be at column index 0, row index 0. So this will be my first guy. My second guy is going to be at column index 2 with a row span of 1 and a column span of 1. So kind of keep this in mind because when I run it, you'll see this text display inside of each element. We'll have something at column index 2, which is just a row span of 1, a column span of 1. And then we'll have something that is a little bit wider, so it's a row span of 1, but a column span of 3, and that'll be at row index 2. So we have starting at a row index of 0, so 0, 1, and 2 on the row, and it'll be at column 0.
So Jason, by looking at this API, it seems that what's going on is first you're defining the size of how much each one of these components takes up space within this virtual grid, and then you're telling it where to show up in this virtual grid, like 0, 0, right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Pretty easy.
It's pretty easy, and when you think about how you lay out web pages, this becomes increasingly important because you want to have a really good layout. And so here you can see we've set this up. Now you'll notice that as I move, my items are getting smaller and smaller. I never actually end up with a big scroll bar on the horizontal scroll bar of the item because we're resizing this based on the layout manager and the layout algorithm. We're sticking to the column spans and the row spans that we've set up. So here you can see we have 1 row span and 3 column spans. This has 2 column spans. So we actually have 3 columns set up, and we're just spanning individual elements across this to create the layout, the desired layout. Now at samples.infragistics.com, which I think I had popped up here, we actually have a bunch of different examples of this. So let me just jump over to controls and samples really quick, and I'll bring up the layout manager. So you guys can take a look at all of these different custom layouts. You can get an idea here that, wow, there's some pretty interesting things that you can do with the different layout scenarios. So the border layout may be the most common layout because what you want to do is have a fixed header, footer, side area, top area. That could be, that's the border layout. And then, of course, there's column layouts, which is your typical newspaper scenario, or like what the MSN homepage looks like now, where you've got a bunch of elements that are spanning different rows and different columns, and then as you resize the page, they'll resize with it. And if you look at some of the layouts like that you see today on MSN.com, you can basically do the exact same layout with the layout manager, and that's why this is so neat. And as this resizes, you can see that the visual changes as well, and you can stick controls in there. So based on the layout, you can have a different template and show sort of whatever you want, be it a slider control or something grayed out or dimmed out. It's really up to you. So anyway, you get a really rich layout experience with this, and it kind of opens up the layout story that we have. And I think one of the features that we did work on the most for this release was around layout with the tile manager and the layout. So let's take a look at the tile manager, and we'll just do one of these samples. If we look at the code, you're going to see that we have, this one's actually pretty straightforward and simple, but the idea with the layout manager is that you can have different templates based on the visible content area of the tile. So it gives you flexibility on how something ends up getting rendered based on how the user is looking at it. So let me just go ahead and run this guy. And you can see here we've got a tile manager of 4 tiles. I can expand one tile, and you can see that the main guy that I expanded took up the bulk of the screen. The other guy shifted over to the right-hand side, and I can scroll now this list of items. If I want to look at Bill Gates, I can expand him. I've got a scroll bar on him, and I can actually then have this customized layout however I want. I can have any sort of a tile layout with this, and then with any sort of layout with this, and what the tile manager does is it actually puts this adorner on your tiles, so then you can interact with these guys at runtime and kind of have a nice interactive experience. So I mentioned earlier the concept of maybe something like a dashboard scenario, where you may want to have charts and grids, and then as a user wants to dig deeper into one element, you give them the opportunity to actually drill into that. It's just a way of looking at this. And you can see here's a much richer layout with the tile manager. So we've got more things on the screen, and as I double click the header, so my adorner is actually not visible, but the interactions are visible. So you can have any sort of interaction that you want, and then nice, as I resize, you can see that each element resizes with my screen, and of course you can choose based on your responsive pattern how you want this to work. But this is pretty exciting. I mean, the ability to have a really rich layout experience like this opens up your opportunities with the Ignite UI toolkit.
And Jason, you know what? I talk to a lot of customers, and a lot of times they ask me, like, well, hey, Tom, do I have to build 10 different pages of my app so that it targets different devices? I mean, that is one way you can approach it, but the thing is, Infragistics gives you a lot of these web-based controls that you can just build one page, and it automatically adjusts, like various components and various content areas hide themselves based on what device it loads into. So it's all declarative. You notice that through our tile manager or through our, the layout manager as well, and even the grid and the charts, you pretty much define beforehand the way things will look within different sizes. We give you 3 sizes to work with out of the box. You get the regular mobile phone size, which is like the smallest size. You get tablet size, which is a little bit bigger. That's the one in the middle. And then you have like regular large form factor screen size. But as you saw Jason's code before, Jason made 2 custom sizes, so you can do that as well. So you define what the UI looks like all on one page, and you create templates, and it automatically shows up whenever the device is used to load up the page.
Yeah, it's actually pretty sweet. Now, one last thing I want to show is the pivot grid example. So let me bring this up really quick and just give you guys an idea of what this looks like and what the interactions look like. So let me make I have my screen kind of set to pretty big here. Let me collapse my splitter. There we go. So what we have here is this is the pivot view experience. So on the right-hand side, I've got my whole data navigator set up. So you can see that I can choose my my cubes within my data, or my data source within my data source, my cubes, and then all of the cube data that I have access to. So all of the dimensions, all of the measures, all of the catalogs that I want to work with. But this one's already set up, so a lot of the samples are already set up. But the idea is this is all happening down in the browser, all in the client. It's going back to the server to refresh data. So as I expand each expansion indicator, I'm going to get additional data to show up on my screen. So the nice thing about this type of data analysis is that you get a whole slew of stuff that you other visually wouldn't be able to get in sort of a regular flat grid experience. So the column groupings that come along with your multidimensional data are what make it extremely powerful and extremely useful to end users. So also here I have my filter icon, so I can actually do this drop down, and I can choose what elements in my data that I want to show or hide. So let's say I don't want to show components or clothing. I'll click OK. The data actually refreshes, and it'll remove those items from my view. Same with my sales territories. Let's say we're doing analysis, and I really don't want to focus on Canada for this particular report. So there goes Canada, it disappears. But anyway, I wanted to show this because I think pivoting ends up being something very interesting for interacting with a grid and giving users a different way of looking at data. And it doesn't have to always be OLAP data. It can be flat data as well. And since this is the pivot view, you can see the new splitter control in action. So this splitter, this layout has two content areas with the splitter, and the splitter is showing or hiding the content block on the right-hand side. So it ends up being a pretty interesting layout there as well. So with that, that'll end all of the demos. I think we're nearing the end of time here. Let me jump back to the deck and go through a couple more slides. So this is a quick summary of what's new in 13.1. A lot of new stuff, a lot of new framework capabilities, a lot of enhancements to the product set. We did focus a lot on layout. We focused a lot on data binding, for example, around knockout across all the data bound controls. And then we did new controls like the pivot grid, new control, tile manager, new control, splitters, a new control, Doughnut charts, Sparkline, funnel, linear and radial gauges. They're all brand new controls in the Ignite UI toolkit for 13.1. And then I didn't really touch on all of the data chart new features, but we did add some new series. So you have your category point, category stack series. We added scatter series on spline, polar spline area, and then the radial series. So a ton of value, of new value in 13.1 for Ignite UI. So in review, yes, it is a mobile world. It's a tablet world. You need to have touch everywhere, and we've done that in this toolkit. If you need a touch-enabled mobile hybrid or pure HTML experience, Ignite UI is the most complete toolkit on the market to deliver that. We have rich layouts, responsive web design built into controls, data binding support with Knockout, and other frameworks as well. So when you think about Backbone, we have blogs on Backbone, blogs on Angular, blogs on different types of frameworks and how you can use Ignite UI with those frameworks as well. Every control that you see has an MVC wrapper that ships with it for MVC 2, 3, and 4. So you can do all the server-side coding you want with these controls. It's not limited to client-side. We have full theme owner support. I mentioned earlier we have the complete trifecta of grids, the only vendor on the market to deliver all three of these grids with the feature sets that we have. And then, obviously, Ignite is the richest, most modern set of jQuery controls on the market today. So finally, from a service perspective, I urge you to go to community.infragistics.com. You'll see blogs, you'll see forums, you'll see help, you'll see videos. There's all kinds of information there. Our forums are pretty much the fastest way to get any type of support We have 24-hour turnaround on those forums. Every day we try to get down to 0 posts. It's almost 1 million people on our forums right now. Our customer base is a little bit over 2 million now. So they're very active. There's all kinds of information, and you'll be able to get answers very quickly from, if it's not the product team, from guys on the support staff. And then Twitter, if you really want to get an answer really fast, just tweet us, because of course there's a few hundred people here just always having Twitter open somehow or on their phone, and they'll get to your ask pretty quickly. So please use our Twitter, and if you don't, please follow us on Twitter. So with that, we will look to see if there's any questions. I believe there's a chat window, and we'll answer any questions right now. But if you want to ask questions later, you can always just send me an email at jasonb@infragistics.com, and we'll get it returned to you. So thank you for the webinar, and we'll end it now. I'll stay online to answer questions in the chat window for a while, and thank you.